Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from X-Hex, titled Rips. So I've talked about in the past how indie rock musicians tend to have several bands and side projects firing at once. Some in the hopes that one will actually manage to strike gold, and some because they've got different musical ideas and genres that they want to really explore and dig into. But indie rock did not invent this phenomenon by any stretch of the mind. And if you want to look at where it's probably most prevalent, you need to start looking at punk rock. And the story of this band begins around 2 decades ago in the exploding punk and indie scenes of the 90s, particularly surrounding feminist-themed Riot Girl. Now, the first important band in this conversation to know about is Sleater-Kinney, the critically beloved band full of explosive energy and who were way more mature and intelligent than most of the punks in their scene. They released several essential albums throughout the 90s before fading away gracefully in the 2000s to go on hiatus. Now, the second important act to mention here is Helium, an alt-rock act that would come to be fronted by Mary Timony, an eclectic singer-songwriter that would bounce around a fair bit in the indie scene. The tepid reception of Autoclave to a few solo efforts that really didn't go anywhere. In the late 2000s, all their careers seemed to have stalled out somewhat, at least in music. I mean, Carrie Brownstein was focusing on the cult comedy show Portlandia, Janet Weiss was doing work with Stephen Malkmus and Conor Oberst, and Mary Timony was working on one of her many side projects. Yet in 2010, with keyboardist Rebecca Cole of the Minders, late 2010, they managed to pull together into the supergroup Wild Flag for a self-titled album, and it seemed like a second life had been breathed into their careers, especially considering that Brownstein used her TV show to give the band a lot of visibility that most indie rock bands would never get. The album was critically acclaimed for damn good reason, it's awesome, and from there it seemed like anything was possible. And yet unfortunately the success of Wild Flag was pretty short-lived, as it was announced that Sleater-Kinney would be reuniting for a comeback record next year. Undaunted, Mary Timony decided to call up Laura Harris, formerly of Aquarium, and Betsy Wright, formerly of Fire Tapes and Child Ballads, for a new group she called X-Hex, named after one of her solo albums in the mid-2000s, and in record time, a debut album was ready to go, called Rips. And let's be fair here, there were some pretty serious expectations for this band, given Mary Timony's knack for melodic riffs and deftly textured songwriting. So, okay, I was definitely interested. What did we get with this? Well, we got a pretty damn solid album, that's for sure. Like most Mary Timony related projects, Rips by X-Hex is pretty damn good. Hook-driven, well-written and performed, intelligent, and it does exactly what it's designed to do. In this case, be a note-perfect modernization of what Joan Jett's band, The Runaways, would have sounded like today in the modern world of indie rock, at least in terms of the instrumentation. But what makes X-Hex stand out, however, is a sense of cohesion, clarity in songwriting, and very different attitude than the reckless, blunt, heavily sexualized power that defined Joan Jett. This is a more refined and more controlled project, and there are definitely some consequences to that. Mostly on the good side, but there were a few that weren't so good. Let me stress that. So okay, before we get into that, let's start with Mary Timony herself. If you're familiar with her earlier material, her mode of delivery was more of a stiffer, sing-talk style delivery. I tend to work with her more verbose and literate songs. But that changes here for a more melodic focus, likely trying to emulate some of that rougher retro style she's going for from the 70s. Then again, Timony's a very different person than Joan Jett, and it comes through most in her delivery. She's nowhere near as raw or aggressive or forwardly sexual, but that's not saying she isn't committed to her material or isn't expressive in her own way. She just has that degree of control and maturity, and the emotions that she's trying to capture on this album, she's perfectly capable of delivering them in a way that matches the lyrical framing perfectly. I will say I'm not always a fan of the vocal production, however, that they put on the backing vocalist. The whoosh of that sound feels a little bit overstated. It doesn't really fit with the rest of the production. But you know what, for the most part, they add some welcome presence to Timony's more restrained tone in a very 70s, 80s girl group sort of vibe, and you know what, I kind of dug that. But then again, if I'm looking for a larger issue with this album, it would probably be in the production. Now, for the most part, I completely get why they went for a very cleaner, mid-fi sound in comparison with the Runaways, which were a looser, rougher sort of act. X-Hex is a lot more prim and poised. There's rough edges in the prominent guitar licks, and in some songs, like You Fell Apart, Waterfall, Warpaint, and New Kid, show more of the ruckus energy of punk in the past, but for the most part, this is guitar-driven rock and roll in the cleanest possible terms. And you know what, that's not a bad thing by any stretch. Mary Timony writes incredibly strong melodic licks, and her guitar solos on songs like Beast, Waste Your Time, Radio On, and especially on Warpaint are some very sticky, genuinely catchy, and very prominently featured in the mix. And while her melody lines aren't quite as strong as they were with Wild Flag, this album is aiming for a more groove-driven focus than just pure melody, and with the solid bass lines, it definitely does deliver in that department. I really appreciated that. I just wish the drum production was better. Unlike practically every other act I've covered this year, the drums feel nestled midway to the back of the mix. You can hear them, but the cymbals and the snare drums don't have a lot of crack or real presence, and the kick drums feel very oddly muffled. Now, that could have been intentional. There's a very tight feeling of control to the record that more textured drums could have fractured, but the larger problem here is it just feels kind of inconsistent. There are moments where I have that drumming spark, but then you have songs like Hot and Cold, where they feel just a little bit too quiet to match up with the rest of the grooves on this album. Really a nitpick on a record where the melodic grooves are as strong and well structured as they are, and as much as I did like them, but I gotta admit, whenever I heard it, the drum production was distracting for me. Now this takes us to the songwriting, and like her spiritual forebears on this album, Mary Timony wrote a selection of starkly painted and yet surprisingly nuanced pop rock tracks, mostly detailing a sequence of guys who screwed up royally in the relationship department, hence the title Rips, referring to rips in relationships. Now this sort of subject matter isn't exactly anything new, and Timony is the sort of songwriter to never really get that sort of descriptive in terms of any sort of sexual misconduct. I mean, on You Fall Apart, the guy in question was hunting for girly action. I mean, really? But that's not saying there isn't nuance, both in the lyrics or her delivery. Take the opening song, Don't Want to Lose. She's not so much angry at the cheating, as she seems aware that this guy will eventually come around, but more impatient that he's not there taking action with her. What this implies is a real attitude of maturity and some sense of wisdom throughout this entire album. Not so much raw, passionate anger, but subtler emotions, which are where she's more annoyed and exasperated than anything else, which adds a lot of real humanity to this album and grounds it. What seems to be the underlying theme here is that the guys in question aren't so much malicious, but just kind of clueless and a little bit self-obsessed, not really engaging in the girl's feelings, and that kind of blunts some of the anger. At the same time, though, you will start wondering why our narrator bothers with guys, so for instance, behaves like an ass and gets dead drunk at a party on Waterfalls, leading girls on Radio On, flaunts a new relationship under an ex's nose on How You Got That Girl, or concocts all sorts of hyper-masculine fantasies about himself on songs like Beast, Hot and Cold, and War Paint. And as she expresses on songs like You Fell Apart and Everywhere, it's completely transparent for these guys if you look hard enough. And yet, at many points, even despite him actively wasting her time, she's still with him on some of these songs. And this gets to the root themes of this album and getting to why people allow themselves to be exploited even though they can see it right there in front of them. There's a very stark parallel between this album and Ty Segall's Manipulator that came out earlier this year. But where Ty Segall's nihilism have him believing that everyone is a fundamentally crappy and shitty human being and relationships are just multiple layers of manipulation, XX is a slightly more human and complex picture. It shows how the allure of mystery and affectations that people create about themselves do have a certain amount of power, especially when they start believing in their own lies. And while some of it is just human nature overpowering a rational sense, it's more of a survival instinct. The track New Kid initially feels rather out of place on this album, as a warning for a new kid to be very wary of schoolmates who might exploit or attack her for no good reason. But in reality, it kind of fits, because that's the way sometimes you have to survive and you don't want to be taken advantage of or exploited. And then we get to the last two tracks, Everywhere and Outro, the former where the relationship actually ends, and yet the girl still searches for it on some level. She knew that it had to end, but deep down, she didn't really want it. And Outro actually gives us that resolution, with the lyric, we lay beside our minds and watch the time grow, implying a separation between her emotions and rational thought. And with the two of them finally coming to consensus on that song, there is nothing left but to just end the crappy relationship. And that gets to the crux of the theme of this album. If you bring your emotions and rational thoughts in line with each other in crappy relationships, then relationships will end, but then you'll be alone with the truth. And if this album says anything, it's that nobody can handle the truth, especially about themselves. So you know what, to summarize, I really liked Rips by XX. I've cooled on it a little bit since the first few times I listened to it, where I was just head over heels over it, because the production issues do remain annoying, and I do wish the melody lines were a shade or two more complex like they were with Wild Flag, but as it is, it's an extremely solid record that effectively accomplishes what it was designed to do, especially in that retro vein. It's not reinventing the wheel, but here it doesn't need to because it's that good. For me, it's a very strong 7 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation, especially if you're a fan of old school runaways and some lyrics that are surprisingly cerebral if you start digging in between the lines. And in terms of melodic, guitar-driven, female-fronted indie rock this year, outside of Always, you're not gonna find many better. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Do you guys think that retro theme really redeems this album? Leave some comments about it. I'm actually genuinely curious how you guys end up seeing this, because it's getting a lot of rave reviews. Curious whether or not you think they deserve them. If there's any other albums that you want me to cover going up in the next week, yes, I'll be covering Lil Wayne, Run the Jewels, and Taylor Swift. You don't need to ask about those. If there's anything else besides those, I'd be happy to cover them. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'd be more than grateful. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.